Picture this. The Carpathian foothills, Easter morning, 1459. You're a Saxon merchant travelling the trade road to Brasov when the fog lifts. What you see makes your horse rear in terror. 20,000 stakes line the road for miles. 20,000 bodies in various stages of decay, arranged by height like a grotesque garden. Men, women, children, impaled. But that's not what makes you vomit into the morning mist. It's the positions, the deliberate, calculated positions. Some stakes entered through the rectum, carefully oiled to keep victims alive for days. Others through the vagina, with the victim's own weight driving them deeper. Mothers impaled through the chest with their infants forced to nurse from their dying bodies. Husbands and wives facing each other, watching each other's agony. The smell hits you, decay, excrement, the sweet sick scent of blood. But underneath it, something else. Expensive perfume, incense. Because there, on a carpeted platform between the stakes, sits a table set with golden plates. And at its head, breaking bread and sipping wine while surveying his garden, sits a pale man with green eyes and a black moustache. Vlad the Third Dracula, the Impaler. And he's having breakfast. He notices you, smiles, gestures for you to join him. Because in Vlad's Wallachia, refusing an invitation from the voivode means joining his garden. As you dismount on trembling legs, you realize this isn't just cruelty. This is something infinitely worse. This is cruelty transformed into art, sadism into statecraft, sexual violence into psychological warfare. Welcome to the Hollow Throne. I'm your host, and today we descend into one of history's darkest psychological profiles, a ruler who weaponized sexual violence and turned torture into theater. This episode contains explicit discussions of sexual torture, impalement, psychological sadism, and systematic dehumanization. We'll be examining historical accounts of forced cannibalism, sexual mutilation, and the weaponization of rape and torture as tools of state terror. This content is extremely disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. But here's why this matters. Vlad the Impaler wasn't just another medieval tyrant in an age of tyrants. His reign from 1448 to 1476, across 3 separate periods, represents something unique in the annals of human cruelty, the transformation of sexual violence into a science of control, where the human body became a canvas for political messaging. The historical sources, German pamphlets, Russian tales, Turkish chronicles, and Romanian oral traditions, paint a portrait so extreme that for centuries, historians dismissed much of it as propaganda. But here's the disturbing truth. Archaeological evidence keeps confirming the accounts. Mass grave sites with evidence of impalement, treaties mentioning his methods, contemporary letters describing the horrors. What makes Vlad's story essential isn't the gore, it's understanding how sexual sadism became statecraft. This is about how trauma breeds trauma, how victims become perpetrators, and how a culture of violence becomes institutionalized. It's about what happens when psychopathy meets absolute power and decides that human suffering is not just useful but beautiful. Picture this. The Ottoman court at Edirne, 1442. 2 boys stand before Sultan Murad II, Vlad, age 12, and his younger brother, Radu, called the Handsome. They're hostages, surety for their father's loyalty. But the Ottoman court isn't just a prison, it's an education in sophisticated brutality. For 6 years, young Vlad watches and learns. He sees the Ottoman justice system where impalement is a standard punishment for severe crimes. He watches enemies of the state tortured in the palace courtyard. But most traumatically, he watches what happens to his brother Radu. Radu's beauty catches the Sultan's eye, and later his son Mehmed's. While the historical record is deliberately vague, chroniclers hint at what modern historians call institutionalized pederasty. Vlad watches his younger brother become the Sultan's favorite through submission. Where Radu bends, Vlad breaks. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who studied serial killers and tyrants, notes vital. Vlad's later obsession with penetrative torture impalement suggests a psychological fixation born from powerlessness, transformed into ultimate power. He took what was done to him psychologically, and perhaps physically, and literalized it into his signature form of execution, the making of a monster. The Ottomans didn't just traumatize Vlad, they educated him. He learned Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. He studied the Quran alongside Byzantine military tactics. Most importantly, he learned the Ottoman philosophy of terror. Fear prevents more bloodshed than mercy ever could. Consider what shaped the teenage Vlad, witnessing hundreds of impalements in Ottoman justice, sexual abuse and exploitation endemic to hostage life, his brother's success through sexual submission, his father's betrayal, trading his sons for political favor, the murder of his father and older brother while he was hostage. In 1447, Wallachian boyars torture and kill Vlad's father, burying his older brother Mircea alive. Vlad learns this while still a hostage. The lesson is clear. In this world, you're either the stake or the impaled. There is no middle ground. Dr. Michael Stone, who created the Gradations of Evil scale, places Vlad at level 22, the highest level reserved for psychopathic torture murderers. But he notes, Vlad wasn't born evil. He was methodically crafted by a system that rewarded cruelty and punished weakness. First reign and flight. October 1448. The Ottomans install 17-year-old Vlad as puppet ruler of Wallachia. His reign lasts 2 months before Hungarian-backed forces drive him out, but those 2 months provide a preview of coming attractions. The German pamphlets record his first act as ruler, inviting the boyars who killed his family to a feast. As they eat, he asks how many princes each has seen reign. Some boast of 20-30 princes. Vlad nods thoughtfully. Then his soldiers seal the doors. What happens next varies by account, but all agree on the sexualized violence. The older boyars are impaled immediately, but slowly on oiled stakes that avoid vital organs. The younger nobles and their wives are stripped naked and marched to Poenari, where they're forced to build Vlad's castle until their clothes rot off and their skin falls from their bodies. The sexual humiliation is deliberate. In medieval society, clothing signified rank. To be publicly naked was to be reduced to animal status. Vlad doesn't just kill his enemies, he unmakes them as human beings first. The Hungarian education. Fleeing to Hungary, Vlad spends 8 years in the court of John Hunyadi. Here he learns Western methods of war and governance, but also Western cruelties. The Hungarian use of breaking wheels, the German preference for burning, the Byzantine art of blinding, Vlad absorbs it all. But he adds his own innovation, the fusion of execution with sexual violation. Where other rulers used torture for information or punishment, Vlad uses it for psychological and psychosexual dominance. A Russian chronicle describes Vlad's studies during this period. He would purchase criminals from the Hungarians to practice his art. He experimented with stake thickness, angle of insertion, methods of prolonging life during impalement. He sought not quick death but extended agony. The sexualized nature of his chosen method isn't coincidental. Dr. Susan Matthews, studying sadistic rulers, notes, impalement is rape made literal and public. It's penetrative violence that feminizes and humiliates the victim while asserting the absolute masculine dominance of the perpetrator. For Vlad, who likely experienced sexual trauma as a hostage, it represents a reversal of power dynamics. Picture this. Targovisht, 1459. You're an Ottoman envoy arriving at Vlad's court. The first thing you notice isn't the castle, it's the garden. But instead of flowers, stakes, hundreds of them, each bearing fruit of flesh. This is Vlad's first innovation, impalement as landscape architecture. The German pamphlets describe his methods with horrific precision. Stakes were carefully oiled and rounded, not to show mercy, but to prevent immediate death. Insertion was an art, too sharp, and death came quickly, too blunt, and the victim died of shock. The ideal stake Vlad discovered was thick as a man's arm, entering the anus or vagina and emerging through the mouth or shoulder, missing vital organs. But here's what made Vlad different. He made it personal. Other rulers delegated torture to executioners. Vlad supervised personally, adjusting angles, critiquing technique. The Saxon Chronicle records. He would walk among the dying, conversing with them, asking about their pain, like an artist discussing his work. The sexual component was explicit. Women were impaled through the vagina, their breasts cut off and forced into the mouths of their husbands or sons before their own impalement. Men watched their wives violated by stakes before receiving the same fate. Children were impaled on smaller stakes in front of their parents. The Russian tale of Dracula describes a scene that defies comprehension. Vlad holding state dinners in his garden of stakes. Foreign ambassadors forced to negotiate treaties while surrounded by thousands of dying people. The moaning of the impaled providing music for the meal. When a boyar complained about the smell, Vlad had him impaled on a higher stake so he would be above the offensive odors. The message was clear. In Vlad's realm, even disgust at atrocity was a crime. St. Bartholomew's Day, 1459. Vlad attacks the Saxon city of Brasov. But this isn't warfare, it's psychosexual theater. He doesn't just conquer, he choreographs an apocalypse. First, he separates the population by age and gender. The elderly are burned alive in the church. The men are impaled in order of social status, merchants higher than craftsmen, creating a literal hierarchy of death. But it's what happens to the women and children that reveals Vlad's particular pathology. The German pamphlet Story of a Bloodthirsty Madman records, he had mothers impaled with their babies at their breasts, the stakes entering through the woman and child together. He forced daughters to eat the roasted flesh of their mothers, wives the genitals of their husbands. But Vlad's innovation was making victims complicit. He would offer choices, impalement or eat your child's heart. Watch your wife impaled or perform necrophilia with your mother's corpse. These weren't just tortures, they were designed to destroy the victim's sense of self before destroying their body. Dr. Robert Hare, who developed the psychopathy checklist, analyzes. Vlad understood that physical death was less terrifying than psychological annihilation. By forcing people into impossible moral choices, he destroyed their humanity before their lives. The survivors were often more useful than the dead, broken people spreading stories of what happens to those who oppose him. The Ottoman Campaign and Psychological Warfare, June 1462. Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, marches on Wallachia with 150,000 men. Vlad has 30,000. By any logic he should surrender or flee. Instead, he creates hell on earth. Picture this scene, recorded by the Byzantine chronicler Chalkokondyles. The Ottoman army, after days of scorched earth tactics and poisoned wells, finally approaches Targovishte. As they crest the final hill on June 17th, the entire army stops. Mehmed, who had walked through the conquered Byzantine Empire without flinching, vomits. 20,000 Ottoman prisoners, soldiers and civilians impaled in concentric circles over 1 square mile. But Vlad hadn't just impaled them. He'd arranged them by rank, pashas on golden stakes, janissaries on silver, common soldiers on wood. At the center, on the highest stake, wearing Ottoman court dress, Hamza Pasha, Mehmed's favorite general, impaled with his own ceremonial sword. The sexual violence was theatrical. Turkish women captured from frontier settlements were impaled naked in pornographic positions. Male soldiers were castrated, their genitals stuffed in their mouths before impalement. Children were impaled on their parents' stakes, families dying together in obscene tableaus. But Vlad wasn't finished. That night, June 1718, he launches the night attack. Disguised as Turks, Vlad and his men penetrate the Ottoman camp, aiming for Mehmed's tent. They kill thousands in the darkness, but more importantly, they spread psychological terror. Ottomans kill Ottomans in the confusion, unable to distinguish friend from foe. The Italian chronicler Michael Boccianulli, present with the Ottoman army, writes, "The Sultan withdrew, saying he could not win the land from a man who does such things and knows how to exploit his rule and his subjects in this way." The women of Vlad's court. The fate of women in Vlad's realm reveals another dimension of his psychosexual pathology. The Russian chronicles describe his treatment of his own mistresses and wives with disturbing detail. One account tells of a mistress who claimed to be pregnant to avoid his wrath. Vlad had her examined by midwives who found no pregnancy. His response, "Let the world see where I have been." He cut her open from vagina to breast, leaving her to die slowly while declaring, "This is what happens to lying women." But Vlad's sexual sadism extended beyond his court. He appointed himself moral guardian of Wallachia, with women bearing the brunt. Adulteresses had their vaginas cut out and their skins publicly displayed. Lazy wives were impaled naked in the public square. Young women who lost their virginity before marriage were forced to wear their sexual organs around their necks until they rotted off. A German pamphlet records the case of a noble's wife, who complained her husband's shirt was too short. Vlad's response, "She should be a better wife." He had her impaled, then forced the husband to marry a peasant girl while his wife's body still writhed on the stake, declaring, "Perhaps this one will make your shirts longer." The most horrific account involves a group of foreign noblewomen visiting Vlad's court. When they refused to remove their veils, a cultural custom, Vlad ordered his guards to nail the veils to their heads. As they screamed and bled, he lectured them on proper respect for Wallachian customs. Dr. Catherine Bell's analysis of sexual sadism in Rulers notes, Vlad's treatment of women reveals classic patterns: the need to penetrate, expose and humiliate. His violence consistently involves unveiling, opening, displaying what should be hidden. It's about destroying privacy, modesty, the boundaries that make us human. The merchant massacre and economic terror. Vlad's sexual violence wasn't random, it was economic policy. The Saxon merchants who controlled trade routes through Wallachia became special targets for his psychosexual theatre. April 1460. A delegation of 40 Saxon merchants arrives to negotiate trade rights. Vlad welcomes them warmly, hosts a feast, then makes his proposal. They will demonstrate their commitment to Wallachia through a test of loyalty. The test: each merchant must castrate himself and present his genitals as a trade offering. Those who refuse are impaled immediately, but slowly, the stakes entering their urethras. Those who comply are then told they've proven themselves unmanly and unfit for trade. They're impaled anyway through the wounds of their self-mutilation. The economic message is clear. Trade through Wallachia requires complete submission, even to the point of self-destruction. The sexual humiliation ensures the story spreads, creating economic terror that extends far beyond military might. But Vlad's fusion of sexuality and economics reaches its nadir with his cleansing of the poor. He invites all beggars, disabled and sick to a great feast, asking if they wish to want for nothing. When they agree, he bars the doors and burns them alive, declaring he has freed them from want. But before the burning, Witnesses report a final humiliation. The poor are forced to strip and perform sexual acts for the amusement of Vlad's court. Men with men, women with women, the old with the young, a deliberate destruction of dignity before destruction of life. November 1462. Vlad's reign of terror finally generates too much instability, even for his allies. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, needing to explain why he kept Vlad's tribute money instead of using it against the Turks, has Vlad arrested on charges of treason. For 12 years, Vlad is imprisoned in Visegrad Castle, but even in captivity, his pathology manifests. Guards report finding mice and birds impaled on tiny stakes in his cell. He creates miniature gardens of death with insects. When given rats as cellmates, a common torture, he turns them into art projects. The Russian tale describes him catching mice and having tiny stakes made by bribing guards, creating elaborate impalement dioramas that he would study for hours. Even without power, without victims, the compulsion remains. Through political machinations, Vlad briefly regains his throne. He's older now, but no wiser, only more efficient. In 2 months he impales more people than in entire years of his previous reigns. The Ottoman chronicler Tursun Beg records, he had learned patience in prison. Now he took his time, stakes were improved. He had studied anatomy, deaths that once took hours now took days. He had perfected his art, death and dismemberment. December 1476. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Ambushed by Ottomans, betrayed by boyars, killed by his own men who could no longer stomach the atrocities. What we know, Vlad dies in battle near Bucharest. But even in death the sexual violence continues. The Ottomans behead him, preserve his head in honey, and display it on a stake in Constantinople. The impaler finally impaled. His body is allegedly buried at Snagov Monastery, but when the tomb was opened in 1931, it contained only horse bones. Even in death, Vlad remains violated, displaced, unmade. Vlad's death doesn't bring relief. It brings revelation of the scope of trauma. Estimates of his victims range from 40,000 to 100,000, in a principality of only 500,000. That's 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 people. Entire villages stand empty. Trade routes remain abandoned for years, but the psychological damage runs deeper. The German pamphlet The Frightening and Truly Extraordinary Story notes that survivors couldn't speak of vegetables on stakes. Even fence posts could trigger panic. An entire generation grew up having witnessed their parents' sexual torture. The trauma embedded itself in the cultural DNA. Here's the twisted irony. Vlad becomes Dracula, the vampire. But vampirism is the perfect metaphor for his actual crimes. The penetration of fangs, the draining of life force, the sexual undertones of vampire fiction, all echo Vlad's actual methods. Bram Stoker, researching his 1897 novel, found accounts of Vlad and recognized the psychosexual horror. The vampire's bite becomes a sanitized version of the stake. The seduction of victims mirrors Vlad's psychological manipulation. The need to invite the vampire in reflects how Vlad made his victims complicit. Dr. Richard Knoll, who studied the psychological basis of vampirism, notes, the historical Vlad was more terrifying than any vampire. He literally penetrated his victims, drained them slowly of life, and created a cult of personality around death. Stoker's genius was recognizing that sexual violence and vampirism are psychologically linked. The patterns Vlad established resurface throughout history. Using sexual violence as political weapon, Bosnia, Rwanda, ISIS. Public display of brutalized bodies as warning, lynchings, cartel violence. Forcing victims to participate in their own degradation. Cultural revolution, Khmer Rouge. Fusion of governance with sadistic theater, Stalin's show trials, North Korean executions. James Gilligan, who studied violence in prisons and wars, writes, Vlad's innovation was understanding that sexual violence destroys not just bodies but identities. Modern torturers study his methods, not the impalement but the psychology. How to unmake a human being. The Romanian historian Nigu Javara makes a disturbing observation. In Romania, Vlad is still considered a hero by many, the man who stood against empires. We celebrate the warrior and ignore the sadist. This selective memory allows atrocity to repeat because we refuse to see the full truth of power. Vlad the Impaler forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The capacity for sexualized violence exists within power structures, not just individuals. Given the right circumstances, war, fear, dehumanization of the other, any society can produce a Vlad. The historian Ioan Bogdan wrote, "We want to believe Vlad was a monster, an aberration. But he was a product of his time, refined to its most horrific potential. The Ottoman courts that trained him, the Hungarian courts that educated him, the boyars who enabled him, all participated in creating this creature. If this historical examination disturbed you, good. It should. When we sanitize history's monsters into pop culture icons, we lose the lesson. Vlad wasn't a vampire. He was something worse. A human being with unlimited power who chose to use it for maximum suffering. Subscribe to the Hollow Throne for more unflinching examinations of history's darkest chapters. Hit the notification bell, these stories matter now more than ever. Share this video not for shock value but for awareness. Those who forget history's monsters are doomed to create new ones. Final reflection, remember this. Vlad ruled for a total of 7 years across 3 reigns. 7 years. In that time he killed up to 100,000 people and traumatized generations. He turned a small medieval principality into hell on earth, and he did it not through superior weapons or vast armies but through weaponized cruelty. The Turkish chronicler Mehmed Neshri wrote the epitaph that should haunt us. He was not a great warrior. He was not a brilliant strategist. He simply understood that humans could be broken through sexual violence and that broken humans break others. He made horror contagious. The throne is always hollow. It's what we allow to fill it that determines whether it becomes a seat of justice or a stage for sadism. Vlad Dracula died 548 years ago. His methods didn't. Think about that.